This is a land full of evil forces, invincible monsters, and an infinite water supply. That's why we are gonna talk about some of the most crazy and crackpot theories in the From community. And starting off, we have demons hiding in the trees. This is something that really took off after Boyd left the dungeon, because there was this scene of something moving in the background while Boyd was running away, and I remember people theorizing that this shadowy blob could be one of those infamous giant spiders that have been getting mentioned since the very first season, but we have yet to see any of them in the show. However, this idea of demons hiding in the forest goes much deeper than even that. Because of Victor saying that the trees have been moving, it definitely makes it seem that Fromland itself might be some sort of living organism, but another possibility is, of course, that the trees themselves are individually alive. Taking this idea even further is the voices talking to Sarah had been watching the townspeople all along. If those voices were simply the trees, then that would explain how they knew where Father Katri buried the bag, because they would have been literally right there while he was doing all of that. There's been a subtle theme throughout this story of the forest somehow being sentient, like Sarah mentioning it's possible the forest gave life to her brother's nightmares of the cicadas and turned them into monsters. The way the road loops back into the town whenever they try to leave can also be seen as evidence of the forest being alive and the trees moving to keep the townspeople from leaving, which we may have gotten a hint for with the tent being moved when Boyd and Sarah were exploring the forest. Martin also told Boyd that there was darkness hiding in the forest, nightmares that we humans were never meant to lay our eyes on. If this thing that was watching Boyd turns out to be more than some sort of production error, I will be incredibly but pleasantly surprised. Ethan has previously mentioned that Victor has drawings of different monsters like boogeymen and scarecrows, which is very interesting consider what we saw in that new village. If those scarecrows really are monsters, then it seems talismans are still able to work on them because they failed to get into Jim and Kenny's cabin. But what's really interesting to consider about these talismans is what their true limit actually is. We know that the monsters themselves are completely incapable of bypassing the talismans, at least based on what we've seen so far. It seems their power is completely unbreakable. They couldn't even go through the vines blocking the talisman hut, and they were unable to get into the RV. But that's actually where this next theory comes in. Because we know the talismans work in tents and even in the RV, what would happen if somebody put a talisman in a car and started driving around with it at night? There's been this incredible idea that the portals, doorways, or whatever it is that is used to enter and exit Fromland is clearly visible at nighttime, which is why the monsters are sent out during that time. Basically, they're being sent out to prevent the humans from finding these supposed exits or whatever else that might be valuable to them that only appears during the night. So if they were able to theoretically explore during nighttime, they'd end up finding very valuable information. It's also interesting to consider whether or not the looping magic that routes the cars back into the town might be deactivated if you had a talisman in the car. Maybe all they need to do is just put a talisman in a car and they'd be able to drive right out of the town itself. While the cicadas and the music box seem to have completely bypassed the power of the talismans, if we assume the tent was being dragged by the trees, then it seems even the forest has to oblige with the rules of the talisman, which is interesting to consider. Tabitha's connection to Victor is an interesting one. She seems to have a level of patience and a mutual understanding with him that no one else seems to have. In a lot of ways, it seems even motherly at times, or perhaps Tabitha was Victor's sister all along. This theory of these two unknowingly being siblings is definitely one of the craziest theories out there in this community, ignoring the fact that Eloise and Tabitha have different ethnicities and backgrounds, or that neither Victor nor Tabitha have expressed having any previous memory of each other. Those are things that could, in theory, just be swept away by the writers, and with Victor's memory loss, it's actually very easy to argue that his theoretical hypothetical sister might have her own memory loss just like he does, perhaps with both of their minds being wiped by some sort of sinister entity in Fromland. Because of Abby and possibly Elgin, there's definitely hints sprinkled out through the story of people possibly leaving Fromland decades ago and then coming back in the future. Could be that's the case with the Tabitha and that she was pulled back in because she was already here previously. And this actually brings up an even crazier theory than even this, which is that Victor's mom is actually Julie. Now this this whole idea relies on some sort of time travel happening in this story that ends up sending Julie back to the past one way or another, and she has kids with some random guy. And these kids, of course, end up being Victor and his sister Eloise. This theory really took off because of Victor's mom having the same bracelet that Jim made for Tabitha before Julie was even born. The bracelet was lost on the night of Julie's birth and was never seen ever again until after the Matthews entered Fromland, where Tabitha found it in the storage room at the diner. This entire idea is absolutely insane because time travel always messes up any story that it's a part of, but there's definitely arguments to be made about that concept existing in this universe through things like the dungeon magically appearing in Boyd's location after he lit the torch. That could be proof of some sort of time travel, with Boyd simply going back in time to before the dungeon was destroyed. So for one reason or another, Julie gets sent back with the bracelet and leaves Fromland, where she eventually has two kids who would become Victor and Eloise, and she keeps the bracelet, I guess, to remember her mom or her family in general, would be the theory. But of course, this would mean Julie is Tabitha's mom, who's actually her mom, and oh boy, time travel is truly something. And if we are talking about time travel, then of course I just have to mention the Elgin being Boyd's grandson theory. This one has been going strong ever since his introduction because Elgin clearly knew and had information about this place before he arrived. A lot of us theorized that he'd actually been in the town before when he was a kid or whatever. It's been obvious since we first found out about her pregnancy that whatever was going on with Fatima was incredibly weird. She was told before that she could never have kids, so for her to have gotten pregnant makes it seem like there's something demonic or very special about her child. And with Elgin clearly being unique, and with him specifically telling Sarah he was raised by his grandmother, we already know that his parents, for one reason or another, have been absent in his life. So Ellis and Fatima maybe sent him back in time or something like that as a last resort to protect him from some great event that's going to happen in the future. I've also seen people saying that Elgin will do this grand gesture that ends up saving Ellis or Fatima just like he did before in season 2, but this time they will name their child after him because of what he did to save them. Overall, this one is definitely very wild, but what's interesting about these time travel theories is they end up making massively complicated family trees. And that brings us to the final theory of this video, which is that all the townspeople are related by blood. Now, this one is fascinating considering the wide variety of people we have seen in the town, but we do get some hints in the actual show. Bacta, who is the bus driver, says that she heard about the nursery rhyme, they touch, they break, they steal, from her grandmother. This is weird because this nursery rhyme only exists in this world of From and not in our world. It makes it seem as if Bacta's grandmother was also trapped in the town at one point or another, just like Abby seems to have been there once before, presumably as a child. But I think the biggest piece of dialogue you could use as evidence of this being true would actually be Martin literally telling Boyd, "My blood is your blood." That sentence could have that meaning attached to it if they're all descendants of some person that angered this great and evil entity hundreds or thousands of years ago. You could definitely also use that line of that entity telling Sarah that it wants to make them suffer, as it would be specifically talking about the people who have this hypothetical person's blood flowing through their veins. And this theory, if true, would literally make this a cursed Fromland. There's some moments that could be alluding to time travel, like Jade's backstory where he mentions being comforted on a flight by some older woman after his grandmother's death, and of course the bracelet disappearing immediately after Julie's birth could be some sort of hint that somebody actually went back in time to take it and placed it in the diner. Perhaps this was done to tether the Matthews, or Tabitha specifically, to the town and ensure that she would eventually come. But there's definitely significant issues with some of these theories, like Tabitha's actor being much younger than Victor, whereas Eloise is not that much younger than Victor. However, if they really wanted to do this, they could just bypass all of that using time travel shenanigans. But then again, that's also the same reasoning that people use for the Ethan is Victor theories, or the Victor or Ethan is Martin theories. Something I just remembered is Tabitha did in fact recognize that one toy that Victor had. Could that be a hint? Who knows? There's also the fact that Kenny and his family immigrated from China, but I guess it's not impossible that some descendant of that person responsible for the bloodline curse may have sowed his seed once or twice over in Asia, so there are ways you could explain that. Overall, there's no shortage of crackpot theories to be found about Fromland. But one way or another, Elgin is a very special person. That's something we know for certain. One thing that we don't know are the motives of the kimono creature that keeps coming after him every time he tries to sleep. So watch this video where I talk about what this creature might possibly want from Elgin.